information and insight and investigations of what's going on in the world around us, often tying it into, often tying political matters into biblical truth, which is what we like about Brandon Big B. So, Brandon, I was talking with you earlier, and apparently something that's really in your craw. I was not aware of the details of this story. I've learned a little bit more, but apparently there is a preacher out in Louisiana who shot some thugs in and around his church, and now the preacher has been charged criminally. Tell us all of this and your insight and wherever you want to go with that, because that's an interesting story.
No, it's very interesting, and there's a lot to be learned from this all the way around. But listen, I have to throw you a quick curveball.
Okay, go ahead.
Before I get into that, I would like to make a promise to our listening audience based on the conversation that you and Mike Shoesmith had earlier.
Yes.
And my promise is this, that today, that I will not talk about how Christians in Iraq and everywhere except the United States of America are living the tribulation. I will not talk about how the pre-tribulation rapture theory is being used to sideline Christians in the United States. I will not talk about how that theory will be used that millions of Christians potentially will run away from their faith because of that teaching when tribulation comes to the United States. Well, that's my promise, is I will not talk about any of that today.
Well, I'm so proud of you that you're not going to talk about that because, I mean, if you did talk about that, there's a possibility you could make people mad, and I know that you're really concerned about that.
Well, listen, I know that I haven't made anybody mad because everybody that was going to be mad about all that turned off their radio during you and Mike Shoesmith. I'm
telling you. Well, listen, and I want to tell folks out there, listen, there are people a whole lot smarter than me who have varying interpretations of apocalyptic literature and eschatology and end times and prophecy. Listen, I know that. And I do not claim to be 100% right and all of that. And I often say, look, I believe passionately what I believe, but I'm willing to be corrected biblically, contextually, biblically. Don't hand me some book somebody's written and say, hey, read this. No, show me in the Bible.
That's right.
Show me contextually in the Bible. And I just don't see pre-trib rapture in there. Now, I just don't. Now, I wish it was true. I want that to be true. I want it to be true. I've tried to pull the scriptures together to make it true, but contextually, I can't do it. But I admit that I could be wrong in this. But what you just said is right. There are no pre-trib rapture believers in the Middle East, and especially in and around Iraq and Mosul and Syria right now. I guarantee you, brother, people watching their children getting their heads cut off and their wives raped before their eyes. There's no pre-tribbers over there.
And it's very unfortunate, but before long in the United States, there won't be any here either.
Yeah.
So,
well,
but listen, like I said, my promise is that I wouldn't talk about all that today. So
but you
don't
didn't
make me break my promise.
But you didn't promise that you wouldn't get me fired up about it, and that
right.
I wouldn't go off on some tangent. So anyway, but back to this preacher that shot somebody. And if you don't get back to that, I may shoot you.
Well, no, I hear you. But listen, I love the city of New Orleans. You said earlier, in the broadcast today, obviously we spent some time there. We lived there. I was very young. But I love that city. I love going there. I am not a city person, but if I have to go and be in a city, that's where I want to go.
Right. And you work out of New Orleans a lot.
I do. I spend a lot of time there with work, and I was there the last couple of days.
Yep.
And today being the anniversary of Katrina, listen, it is great to ride around that city and see the way that city has returned.
Right.
And the way that our nation got behind that city and funneled money and resources there. And to see a lot of the corruption that has been there in the past being cleaned up. Now, there's still a lot there, granted, but I love that city. I affectionately refer to New Orleans as the nastiest, dirtiest, most beautiful city in the world.
Yeah, it really
is.
It really is. But, there's a lot of history and culture there. The food is amazing. A lot of historical sites to see, Civil War stuff. It's an amazing city.
In 2017, New Orleans will be 300 years old.
Yeah.
City of New Orleans.
That's amazing.
And it's so full of history, and of course, being in the building business, I love downtown,
the architecture,
old buildings, and the French Quarter. I mean, you can feel the history there, and then there's a very dark side to the city as well.
Absolutely.
But I love that city, so I have to give a shout out to New Orleans. I enjoyed the last couple of days there, and I love it every time I get to go there. But when I was there, 2 days ago, headlines were this, that one Reverend W.L.T. Littleton, who pastors a Baptist church in the West Bank community of Algiers. Now, it's for anybody that's familiar with New Orleans, that's just a little suburb right across the river there.
Right.
He's a former New Orleans Police Department officer as well.
Wow.
And check this out. He's also a local radio host in New Orleans.
Wow. The reason you're saying that, because
you feel any of that?
yeah, because most of our listeners know that I'm a former cop and a radio host and a longtime pastor. So so far, this pastor and I, our resumes are very similar.
And the guy's been pastoring for 30 years in the same community.
Yeah, and I've been pastoring for 28 years in the same community.
So the similarities in your life and ministry and his, just on the surface, I don't know anything about the depth of this guy, but just on the surface, were so striking to me. And then I hear this story that the original reports were that he was in his church, some guys tried to break in, he stopped that break-in, fired at them, and then continued firing at them with his firearm as they were leaving the scene. And he was not arrested originally. Now, it turns out I actually have the Times-Picayune article that gives the details of the arrest warrant. And what actually happened was, after the facts came out, it appears that he came upon two guys on his church grounds trying to steal copper out of the air conditioning unit.
Mm-hmm.
He takes out his sidearm that he apparently has legally,
mm-hmm.
and attempts to hold the guys at gunpoint until law enforcement arrives.
Okay.
In the meantime, of him holding them at gunpoint, they flee, get in a truck, and head towards him in the truck. In other words, this is out of the arrest warrant now, threatening his life with their vehicle.
Right. He
begins firing at them. They pass him with the truck, so now at this point they're fleeing from him. He continues firing and hits one of the thieves, the thugs, the garbage criminals in the back of the head.
Okay. The
guy's in serious condition at a New Orleans hospital. The other one has been arrested.
Okay.
Now, the pastor has also now been arrested and charged with aggravated battery for firing at a fleeing person. Okay, so I don't really want to talk legalese on this, but here's what's disturbing. I wake up this morning and I leave New Orleans about 5:30. I'm listening to a local talk radio program there that is typically very conservative, and they are basically blasting this pastor
mm-hmm.
for defending his church property, for defending himself, and they are also quoting another Times-Picayune article where a writer for the Times there has blasted this pastor, and they continually make a quote, something like this. I'm paraphrasing, but this is very close to what most of these commentators are saying. If a man of the cloth doesn't respect life enough that he fires on someone fleeing from him, or he fires on someone attempting to do harm to him, then where are we at as a country?
Mm-hmm.
So my question is, as a, quote, man of the cloth, would you defend your property? Would you defend your life?
Yeah. Well,
if it came down to it, and I hope and pray you're never in that situation.
Yes.
Neither am I.
Yeah, me as well.
But, I guess the deeper question is here, biblically, as a pastor, are you allowed to do that?
Right. Okay. Well, first of all, biblically as a pastor, you are allowed to do that, and we can get into those scriptures and those biblical standards. Now, it comes down. It's really a personal thing. I mean, if anybody, a pastor or otherwise, says, you know what, I'm not going to carry a gun, not going to have a gun in my house, not going to have one in my car, not going to have one in my person, not going to have one in my business. I'm just going to go through life, quote, trusting in God. That's okay. But I would ask that person, really, do you ever wear a seatbelt? Do you ever get the flu shot? Do you ever go to the doctor when you're sick? Do you wash your hands, before you, a surgeon, do you wash your hands before you do surgery, what do you mean? I mean, we take precautions with protecting our lives every day. Yeah. So, and why don't you just trust in God? Why don't you just never wash your hands? Why don't you never wear a seatbelt? Why don't you never take medicine again? Why don't you never, I can go down the list of things. Well, what do you mean? I mean, why you pick out this one thing and say, "Oh no, I'm a man of God, so I'm just going to trust God." Well, of course I trust God, but God also gives us common sense. It was Jesus that told his own disciples, "Look, we're living in tough times. I'm getting ready to leave you. I'm going to a cross. You might want to sell your coat and buy yourself a sword."
Yeah.
I mean, Jesus
listen,
said that.
That's exactly the scripture that came to my mind when I heard this. And for people that don't know, that's out of Luke chapter 22. And to put it in context, Jesus is having the Last Supper with his disciples. He's spending the last few hours on earth with his disciples. And what you just said is exactly what he's telling them. He's saying, "Look, guys, I've been with you, protecting you for these last years, but I'm getting ready to go.
Right.
And times are going to get tough, and you're going to be persecuted. And, oh, yeah, by the way, you're going to endure some tribulation.
Right.
And, oh, yeah, by the way, your lives might be threatened. And, by the way, all of you will eventually die as martyrs for me."
Right.
That's the context of what Jesus is telling his disciples. And he says in verse 36, he tells them, he says, if you don't have a sword, sell your cloak and buy a sword. Well, guess what? We don't fight with swords anymore.
Right.
So today's version of the Bible reads, sell your cloak, sell your coat, and buy a what? A Glock.
Buy a Glock. That's basically what he said. Yeah, and Jesus, isn't saying, "Look, go out and start shooting at everybody." Of course,
no, he's not.
Yeah,
no.
I mean, he's just saying, be prepared.
We have the right to defend ourselves.
Exactly.
Listen, I have searched today, all through the Bible, everywhere I can think of, where we see qualifications for a pastor and for leaders in the church, for elders and deacons. And First Timothy is full of those qualifications. There's some stuff in First Peter and in Titus. In Acts, and guess what? Nowhere in any of those qualifications does it say that a pastor should never defend himself, should never practice self-defense, and should never stand up for himself. In fact, it talks about a pastor being a man that leads and shepherds and protects his family.
Protects the flock. Well, again, and it's not just yourself. I don't only have the responsibility as a Christian, much less a man of God, pastor, to protect myself, but what if I've got a group of youth from the church and I've got them on some event and some thug comes in amongst us and wants to grab up some little girl and kidnap her? Now, don't you think those girls' parents would really think highly of me if I was at that time able to defend that girl's life and get rid of that thug so that the little girl wasn't kidnapped because that girl was under my care? So I have a responsibility to not only protect myself, but others as well. I mean, that's just life stuff. Those are God-given rights and responsibilities.
Yeah, no, absolutely, I agree. But it's just amazing that in the times in which we live, and again, you and Mike Shoesmith have covered that today, but things are only getting worse here. And I'm not fear-mongering. I'm not, trying to scare people. But I'm just saying, listen, read the book. Read to the end. Things get worse before they get better.
Right.
Okay? So in today's world especially, listen, you and Dr. Grace just got done talking about it. ISIS, apparently, is at our southern border.
Right.
Now, how they got there and where they've gotten their weapons and their funding is a whole other conversation for a whole other day.
Right.
But they're here, and that's a real threat. Now, who are they assaulting and persecuting and torturing in the Middle East?
Right.
Oh, yeah, that's Christians.
It's Christians.
So who should be preparing to defend themselves here in the United States more than any other group right now in the times in which we live?
Right. Probably Christians. We're going to have to take a time out, Brandon Bigby. When we come back, we'll continue this.